Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Kawakeb webinar. I would like to introduce today's speaker. Having received his PhD in philosophy from Harvard, Professor Thomas Pogge is professor of philosophy and international affairs and founding director of the Global Justice Program at Yale. He co-founded Academic Stand Against Poverty, an international network aiming to enhance the impact of scholars, teachers, and students on global poverty, and Incentives for Global Health, a team effort toward creating new incentives that would improve access to advanced pharmaceuticals worldwide. Prof. Pogge is an expert political philosopher with a primary interest in the idea of justice. On a personal note, my first encounter with Thomas was when I took a seminar on Joe Rawls and his theory of justice, also known as the justice guru, I guess. When I read Realizing Roles, that's how I first met, if you wish, Thomas. Back then, I still remember that I wondered how to pronounce his family name. So I hope after all these years that I got it right. Thomas is a prolific writer and thinker with more than 25 books, as well as a plethora of articles and book chapters on global ethics, political thought, justice, and global health. It is a pleasure and an honor having you with us, Thomas. The floor is yours.
Yeah, very happy to be here, Talia. I'll try to keep this to 25 minutes, and so we'll power through relatively quickly. But of course, we'll have lots of opportunities to discuss it afterwards. So this is really about a new way of incentivizing innovation. And let me start off by saying that this is largely focused on pharmaceuticals, that pharmaceutical research is very expensive, largely because of the extensive clinical trials that have to be run on new pharmaceuticals to make sure they're safe and effective. And also because it just takes a long time until a product finally reaches the market. And during that time, no profits are made by the innovator. And of course, there's also a high failure rate. So people estimate that the cost of bringing a new medicine to market is somewhere in the order of $1 billion. Some people talk about $3 billion. In any case, it's very expensive, and nobody would be able to undertake this sort of work unless it were rewarded. So we need to incentivize innovation. And big pharma companies are the ones that are doing a lot of this pharmaceutical innovation, or at the least they are the gatekeepers that are funding this innovation, buying up smaller biotechs and so on. They have the capital to take something forward towards marketing approval. And they're currently being incentivized and rewarded through temporary monopolies, 20-year product patents, that the World Trade Organization requires its member states to grant under the TRIPS agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. This is a relatively new piece of our global institutional architecture. It was introduced in the mid-1990s, and it replaced a regime where different countries had different ways of incentivizing innovation. So a quilt of diverse innovation incentives was replaced by this one-size-fits-all system. A product patent is a patent that protects a product rather than a way of making the product. Many countries, including importantly India, had process patents before, and it was possible for generic companies to invent around a process patent. So they found a new way of making an old medicine and then sold it in India and in many developing countries without violating the process patent. The product patent rule that now obtains closes that window and basically cuts off developing countries from patented medicines, at least the poorer populations in developing countries. So clearly, monopolies impede access. They lead to large markups. The price is much, much higher than the cost of production. And that means that people can't buy it. Here's an example. A very important and very good new drug, sofosbuvir, came onto the market in 2013. It's a hepatitis C drug, and it was introduced at a price of $84,000 in the United States. That is about 1,000 times the cost of manufacturing the drug, which is $84. This is for a course of treatment. 84 pills are needed to be cured of your hepatitis C, and it costs you $1,000 a pill to be cured. In Lebanon, currently the price is $31,884. So still very expensive. It's generally cheaper in lower income countries, but equally unaffordable because, of course, the incomes are lower in lower income countries also. Now, why are prices so very high for new pharmaceuticals and also other patented goods? Well, that has to do with the shape of the demand curve. The demand curve is generally downward sloping. So the more expensive something is, the less demand for it, market demand for it there is. And it's generally also convex. We see that here in this diagram. So depending on how you fix the price, which is on the y-axis on the left, you get demand, which is indicated by the red curve. That could be, everybody who needs it buys it. That would be 100%. Or you get much lower demand when people are excluded by the price. So suppose the innovator chooses $38 as their price, then the profit that they make would be this orange area here. You would get 20% would be the demand, 20% of the people who need it would actually buy it, and that would be multiplied, the number of people buying it would be multiplied by the markup, which is the difference between the blue line, the cost curve, and the $38 price chosen. Now, if you lower the price, you can see that you make less money than before. Yes, you sell a few more copies to additional people, but you lose more money on the lower markup than you gain on selling to additional people. On the other hand, if you raise the price, you make more money. You make more money on the increase in the markup than you lose on the smaller number of customers that you are serving. And that is the typical situation in the world today, and actually not just in the world, but also in most countries. Inequality is very high, and monopolists make more money concentrating their sales on a very small number of people, 10%, 15% of the population of the country or the world, selling at a very high price, than they would do selling more cheaply to a larger number of people. So monopolies impede access. There are generic manufacturers that would be very happy, and once the patents finally expire, are very happy to supply these medicines at very low prices, but they are not allowed to do that because of the patents. Patent enforcement everywhere in the world prevents that, and we have literally millions of people every year dying in this world because they cannot afford medicines that could be mass-produced very cheaply, but cost 100 or 1,000 or more times more than the cost of production. So people, of course, say that granting and enforcing patents is the price that a state has to pay for WTO membership. So the developing countries say there's no choice. We have to, this is imposed upon us. We have to do this because otherwise we don't get access to the Western markets. But from the point of view of us industrialized countries, you might ask, isn't this an enormous injustice that we are inflicting on the world? We are arm twisting poor countries into enforcing these patents for our pharmaceutical companies and many other companies. And by doing that, we are not merely failing to help poor people, but we are actively harming them by interrupting, so to speak, the supply line that they have from generic producers. There are many generic companies in India who would be happy to supply these drugs, but they're simply not allowed to do that because we have pressured the Indian government into accepting the TRIPS agreement and into enforcing these patent rights. Now, it will easily be said that without monopoly enforcement, affluent people would avoid high prices, but pharmaceutical innovation would cease. So if we didn't have these monopolies, then nobody would pay high prices, and then nobody would invent new medicines. That is the standard justification for these high patent rights. People say that it's regrettable that poor people are excluded, but this is the price we have to pay if we want any innovation at all. And this is exactly the argument that I want to try to defeat or topple with the idea of impact funds. I want to show that there are other ways of incentivizing and rewarding innovation that do not cut off poor people. So before I do that, however, let me talk about a few other drawbacks, two other drawbacks to be precise, of the patent regime that also can be overcome by the alternative incentive mechanism. One great additional drawback is that monopolies steer innovation in the direction of problems that rich people have. Because you need to capture a large markup, you will think about, who is able to pay such a hard markup, and you will produce products, you will try to invent and innovate in areas where there is demand from rich people. So the great diseases of poverty receive very little research attention simply because the people who have these diseases are poor, they cannot pay large markups. And so as a result, nobody really bothers to invest much in research into their diseases. That includes tuberculosis, malaria, hepatitis, HIV/AIDS, pneumonia, measles, neglected tropical diseases, and others. And there is a third and final problem that I want to mention, attendant to the monopoly patent regime, and that is that they tend to neglect or ignore externalities. Externalities, that is economists speak, for effects on people other than the user. So in the case of pharmaceutical, the most important externality is that depending on whether you take a certain drug or not, other people may be at risk of being infected from you. If the drug cures you of your disease, you will no longer infect other people, and these other people then benefit from the fact that you have taken the drug. Now, these sorts of externalities, typically positive or good externalities, these externalities are ignored because the buyer, the person who makes the decision about whether to purchase a medicine or not, will not take these externalities into account. They will ask themselves, is it worth it for me to buy the drug? But rarely will they ask, is it worth it for the benefits to third parties if I take this drug? So, and again, it would be better if we took these externalities into account and gave a reward to pharmaceutical companies for giving us medicines that not only cure the person who takes them, but also slow the course of the disease, suppress the disease, contain the disease, and maybe even, if we are lucky, eradicate the disease. So there's underinvestment in exactly those pharmaceuticals which achieve that, and these are predominantly vaccines. There's far too little investment in vaccine relative to other kinds of pharmaceuticals, such as cures and maintenance drugs. So now let's look at the alternative incentive mechanism that we are proposing. It's called the Health Impact Fund, and it's designed to be a complement to TRIPS. So it doesn't destroy TRIPS. it politically, realistically, it takes TRIPS for granted and basically offers pharmaceutical companies to replace their typical markups with something else, which are impact rewards. So any firm that has a new pharmaceutical that it's putting on the market can, if it so chooses, register this pharmaceutical. And if it registers, it will participate for 10 consecutive years in annual reward pools that the Health Impact Fund is disseminating. And each of these pools is divided among all the registered pharmaceuticals in proportion to the health impact that each of them achieves. So we measure at the end of the year the health impact that the registered products have achieved, how much health gain they have produced for patients and for third parties. And in proportion to the achieved health impact, we divide the annual distribution from the Health Impact Fund. Now, who would fund that? Well, one idea would be to fund it from governments. We need something like $6 billion a year to make this work really well. $6 billion, that would mean that each firm registering a product would participate in $60 billion of distributions over the 10-year reward period. And if governments were willing to fund something like that, they would, I think, find that in the end, it costs them nothing. It will actually even make them money because they would save also a lot of money. They would save money on registered medicines because the price of the medicine would be much, much cheaper. They would save money on other healthcare costs because people taking these medicines would not fall ill, would not have to go to the hospital, and so on. There would be economic gains in productivity, and there would be consequent gains in tax revenues. So in all these ways, the Health Impact Fund would largely pay for itself. The Health Impact Fund would allow registering companies to keep their intellectual property rights, but they would be required to sell the new medicine at the lowest feasible cost of manufacture and distribution, and they would then have to grant cost-free licenses after the reward period. So here the basic idea is, of course, that instead of getting the normal markup reward that you have a price that is much higher than your cost, companies are offered the opportunity to register with the Health Impact Fund, to collect health impact rewards, but the downside would be they would then lose the markup. They wouldn't get both rewards. They would have to choose between the one markup reward or the health impact reward. Now, how do we determine the price ceiling, the maximum price at which a Health Impact Fund registered medicine may be sold? Well, it could be determined by a tender where the innovator is asked to offer the contract to manufacture the drug to competing manufacturers. The cheapest manufacturer, or two or three of them, win the contract. The innovator then buys the product from these cheapest producers and sells it to wholesalers at the very same price, that is to say, without any markup. That would be an easy way to figure out what is the cheapest way for producing a particular medicine in large quantities. So let me now go over some of the features and virtues of the Health Impact Fund. This is basically going over ground that we've covered already in a new way, but just to get the idea across as clearly and crisply as possible. So first feature is the Health Impact Fund involves dual optionality. It's optional on the part of the funders and optional on the part of participating pharmaceutical innovators. So funders, governments funding it, they can come in and say, we participate, we contribute a certain amount of our GNP, or they can stay outside. The same is true with pharmaceutical companies. For each and every product, they can either enter the product into the health impact fund, or they keep it outside the health impact fund and take advantage of their usual monopoly patent privileges. This dual optionality is politically very useful because it makes it possible to establish the health impact fund in a gradual way. Second, the health impact fund involves delinkage. So you have the price is capped, and that means that you no longer have the cost of the research affecting the price of the product. The two are delinked from each other, no matter how expensive it may be to innovate, to find this new product. The customers do not have to pay for that innovative step. Rather, that innovation is paid for through these health impact rewards. Now, these health impact rewards are a pay-for-performance scheme. They are paying not for how expensive it was for you or how difficult to achieve the innovation, but rather the innovator gets paid for the quality of the innovation, how much that innovation achieves in the world for actual patients and third parties. So it's a performance-based reward scheme. The more people you reach with your product and the more you improve the health of these people, the more money you get paid. This involves an objective measure of value. So what's completely irrelevant here is how rich or poor the people whom you are helping are. The only thing that matters is how much of a health gain these people realize. Now, the Health Impact Fund asks participating states to make contributions in proportion to their gross national income. That means that larger states and richer states contribute more, smaller states and poorer states contribute less to the fixed cost of innovation and to the profits that pharmaceutical companies can expect. Now, that means that richer taxpayers, the people who are paying at a higher tax rate, are the ones who really end up paying the cost of innovation. And that's exactly what we have now, where early users, also rich people, are paying the cost of innovation. But there is one very big difference. The current system forces us to exclude the poor, because if poor people could participate, rich people would find ways of participating also at the low prices that poor people are paying. Whereas under the Health Impact Fund system, the price of the drug is very low. The big contribution is made through the tax system, and therefore it's entirely possible for everybody to pay the same low price. Poor people can participate in the new drug, can use the new drug from the very beginning. The system is competitive. It achieves a wide competition among all the different pharmaceuticals across all the different disease categories, across countries, across demographic groups. And so a malaria drug may compete against a cancer drug, for example. All of them are competing to achieve as much health impact as possible. And the more health impact any particular pharmaceutical achieves, the more of the health impact reward for the given year does it collect. So each year, the pool is divided up according to health impact achieved. And so all the different registered medicines compete with each other. And that, of course, focuses attention on the lowest hanging fruit. If you ask yourself, what should I innovate? What sort of a drug should I aim for? You will aim for a drug that achieves as much health impact as possible. Now, there is a self-adjustment in the reward rate. So ultimately, all the different participating products get paid at the same rate. They get the same amount of money per unit of health impact achieved. And that rate is self-adjusting. If pharmaceutical companies think that this rate is poor, is not very attractive, then few pharmaceutical companies are going to register their pharmaceuticals, and that means the rate is going to rise because there are fewer participating pharmaceuticals that are competing to participate in the disbursement each year. On the other hand, if the rate is perceived as very attractive by pharmaceutical companies, then more products will be registered and the rate will decline. So the rate is determined by the market. It will adjust to a reasonable level that pharmaceutical innovators find attractive, but not super attractive. That in turn reassures both innovators and contributors. The innovators know the rate will always be reasonable. The contributors know that they will not actually dish out windfalls to pharmaceutical companies. Now, what do we do with non-contributors, with countries that refuse to participate in funding the Health Impact Fund? Well, one good solution to that problem is to say, okay, if you don't want to contribute, then we will not allow you to enjoy the same high prices. And that means the monopoly system remains in force for you. So take, for example, Japan. Japan decides we will not participate, we will not contribute to the Health Impact Fund. Then pharmaceutical companies would remain free to sell their registered products at very high prices in Japan. With poor countries, we wouldn't want to do that. So poor countries, we would want to give a free ride, but rich countries, we do want to exclude from the benefits if they decide that they don't want to contribute to the Health Impact Fund. This reduces the opportunity cost of registration because a company will be more willing to register if it knows that the lucrative Japanese market is still available for patent-protected high markups. And of course, it gives Japan a reason to join because the Japanese people are going to say, why do we not get access at low prices like everybody else? And so they will pressure their government to join the funding coalition of the Health Impact Fund. That gets me to the topic of expanding the fund. Gradually, the fund can become larger and larger. That can happen through economic growth. As the GNP of countries grows, the percentage that they contribute to the Health Impact Fund remains constant, and so the money will increase. There could also be new partner countries, like in the case of Japan. Japan could come on board and could start contributing. And then there could be an agreed to raise in the contribution percentage so that instead of contributing, say, 0.02% of GNP, countries would contribute 0.03%. That would happen if they liked the Health Impact Fund very much and wanted to attract more pharmaceuticals to be registered with the Health Impact Fund. Obviously, the more money is in the annual pools, the more products would be registered. As the Health Impact Fund grows, it would also become more efficient. That's a very nice feature. The reason is that as more and more countries join the Health Impact Fund, the number of beneficiaries increases because the citizens of more and more countries benefit. And also there's more money in the annual pools, and so you can support more pharmaceutical products. So as the Health Impact Fund grows, more people benefit, and they benefit more because more products are in the category of registered products supported by the Health Impact Fund. So by doubling the Health Impact Fund, you could actually quadruple the benefit of the Health Impact Fund by doubling the number of beneficiaries and also doubling the number of cheaply accessible innovations. Now let's look at how the Health Impact Fund would completely revolutionize the attitude of pharmaceutical innovators. In the current world, pharmaceutical innovators are jealous spies. They look all over the universe to see whether anybody is using their innovation without permission. They try to prevent anybody from benefiting from their innovation who hasn't paid the high markup on the price of the product. With the Health Impact Fund, it's exactly the opposite. Innovators have an incentive to want as many people as possible to use the innovation for free. So an innovator will go around the world and say, please use my innovation and use it for free. I will help you to use it effectively. They want as many people to benefit as possible because the more people benefit from their innovation, the more they get paid. They get paid according to the health gains that their innovation achieves. And the more people use it and the more effectively they use it, the more money goes to the innovator. So innovators will have strong motivations to promote optimal use of their product. We want it to be used widely and we want it to be used well. And they also have incentives even to subsidize the product for very, very poor people because they make more money on achieving the additional health impact from helping a very poor person than they lose by selling the product to that very poor person below the cost of production. Now, the companies, in order to be successful under the Health Impact Fund, have to pursue a holistic strategy. They have to think ahead, so to speak, all the way from the workbench, from the computer simulation, all the way to end users, try to find a good strategy for achieving as much health impact as possible. And that's exactly how we want these companies to think. We want them to try to fine-tune their entire operation in such a way that it achieves as much health impact as possible. Now, it's often said, and especially now in the COVID crisis, that pharmaceutical companies tend to put profits above people. A solution to that is to preach to them and say, no, you shouldn't put profits over people. You should put people over profits. You should be devoted to human rights. You should not care about profit. But the Health Impact Fund pursues a different policy. It says we have to align profit and people, or profit and value. We simply have to make profitable whatever it is that we want pharmaceutical companies to do. And then it doesn't really matter whether they are prioritizing profit or prioritizing people, because either way, they will do the same thing. That's the strategy of the Health Impact Fund, to say, we will make it profitable for you to serve people as much as possible, to achieve as much health impact as possible. The Health Impact Fund would further guide innovators to make their investment decisions in light of each potential innovation's full expected impact, and to facilitate each registered innovation's fast and wide and impactful diffusion. So cost effectiveness would be paramount. And these enormous gains in cost effectiveness over the existing system make the Health Impact Fund a feasible idea, because we can save so much money by making the current system better that we can benefit governments, patients, and innovators, all three of them. We can have a triple win. This is not somebody winning at the expense of someone else, but it is making the system vastly more effective and thereby everybody winning. This is my last slide, just to say that the Health Impact Fund is a meta-innovation. It's a new way of rewarding and incentivizing innovation that works not only for pharmaceuticals, but also works in other areas of innovation, for example, in green technologies, in agriculture, and in education. So in green technologies, we have the same sort of problem, that we have wonderful green innovations, but these innovations are marked up. So they are much more expensive than their cost of production. And as a result, people don't use these innovations. And that is really stupid, because we have these innovations, but the emissions continue because many people do not use the innovations that they would gladly use if only they were not marked up so heavily as a result of being patent protected. Anyway, our topic is pharmaceuticals, and so I look forward to discussing that. Thank you.
Thomas, thank you very much for a very clear and enlightening presentation. Allow me to raise two questions before I give the floor to my colleagues. And I'm playing the devil's advocate here. So if you were to assume, as many do actually, that the pharmaceutical companies are also guilty in causing diseases only to produce medication and increase its income, so the side effects, as we know, it's poison in small portions, and thus perhaps allow more room for new diseases and a greater population to get that disease. So the question is, would this not be a way of helping the less advantaged, which is perfect, I mean the health impact fund, which is perfect, yet without correcting the evil behind it? So this might not be feasible, but at least the question is this morally acceptable?
Yeah, so I think the Health Impact Fund does a lot better than the existing patent regime in alleviating that worry. Let me explain why. So if you think about a company that has two different remedies that it can put on the market for the same disease. The one remedy makes patients feel and function better, but they remain sick and they remain infectious. The other remedy is one that actually gets rid of the disease, either prevents it from occurring like a vaccine or cures people of the disease completely, and so they're no longer infectious. So if the company has a choice between these two products, under the present monopoly patent regime, it has a very strong reason to choose the first product over the second. Because with the first product, my market continues, right? There will always be new people falling ill of the disease, and then these new people will also become customers, and I can sell them my product. Whereas under the alternative, if I produce a vaccine, let's say, then there is a danger that in 2 or 3 years, the disease has disappeared. There is nobody left whom I can cure. I lose my market. I have just completely destroyed my future profits with my product. So this is, I think, a substantial part of the worry that you outline. And of course, currently, pharmaceutical companies are very, very tempted, right? You would be an idiot from an economic point of view if you put a vaccine on the market that will destroy the disease on which your profit depends. So it's much better to put a maintenance drug on the market, something that makes people feel better, but keeps the disease in business.
Horrific, yes.
Now, with the Health Impact Fund, this is not a worry, because the Health Impact Fund is neutral between those two. The Health Impact Fund will say that if you eradicate the disease, let's say the best case scenario, in the first 5 years that your product is on the market, you get rid of the disease completely, well, then you still get paid for the health impact of your drug in the next 5 years. Even though you are no longer helping any patients, you are still achieving health impact with your product, because the suffering from the disease is much less thanks to your drug than it would have been if your drug had not come onto the market. And so this is the big difference. Under the monopoly patent regime, you would make no money in those last 5 years, whereas under the Health Impact Fund regime, you would make a lot of money in those last 5 years, and you would make that money without doing any work at all. You could just sit on your hands and do nothing, and you would still be paid for the health impact that your medicine or vaccine, whatever, has produced in the final 5 years of the reward period. You get paid for the full 10 years.
So unless you can cure the insatiable thirst of pharmaceutical companies for more money, even if they're getting the health impact fund, one might argue they will cure, say, diabetes for 5 years. But this cure for diabetes might slowly create a new disease so that they can manufacture a new drug. But that's again, it's a circle.
If they were able to do that, but again, this is something that, you're right. Theoretically, there are incentives that would get around it. So, for example, you might have an incentive to create a whole new disease. So take COVID-19, right? You might say, imagine a clever pharmaceutical company had put COVID-19 out there into the world in order then to harvest the reward for curing people. Now, there is no way of, obviously, if we knew about that, we wouldn't pay that company to provide the remedy. But what we would also do, and what is much more important, is we would jail all these people. These people would go to jail and for the rest of their lives for murder. And that's exactly how it should be, right? So you really need criminal penalties in order to stop people from engaging in this sort of criminal activity.
Absolutely.
But as far as the incentives are concerned, of course, we have to pay pharmaceutical companies to address even new diseases. If a new disease comes out, we need a remedy against it. And again, the best way to pay for such a remedy is to pay according to the health impact that it achieves.
Thank you, Thomas. I'll leave the floor to my colleagues. Do we have any questions?
We have 2 questions in the chat. The first one is raised by an attendee. Is this monopoly not a form of colonialism and subjugation? Someone is asking.
Yeah, so you might say that any payment to pharmaceutical companies is in a way colonialistic in that it rewards companies that typically are in the developed world, right? So I think that's where the question is coming from. Pharmaceutical innovation takes place largely in the developed world simply because it is very capital intensive. As I said at the beginning, you need something like $1 billion to play that game. And very few companies in the developing world have that kind of money. There are now a few, but not very many. So here you might say that makes the whole thing, in a way, colonialistic. But again, relatively speaking, we need these medicines. We need them to protect, especially people in the developing world. And of course, we want, in the long run, pharmaceutical companies in developing countries to be able to participate in this game of innovation, to develop safe and effective new drugs. But for the moment, there is a heavy imbalance in terms of who has that kind of capital. That's not anybody, it's not my fault anyway. And it's not something that we should simply ignore. I think we should not say to poor people in the developing world, look, you will just have to remain sick and nobody's going to help you. You're not going to get any medicines for your sickness until such time as pharmaceutical innovation will take place also in the poor countries. But let me add one more thing. That is that I think with the Health Impact Fund, it is much more likely that pharmaceutical innovation will emerge and thrive in the developing countries. Why is that so? That is so because the Health Impact Fund focuses attention on the diseases of poverty. I gave you a long list: malaria, tuberculosis, neglected tropical diseases, schistosomiasis, and so on. these diseases will suddenly become very lucrative areas of pharmaceutical research. And with regard to these diseases, nobody has done much work so far. And so pharmaceutical companies, pharmaceutical innovators in the developing world are not starting that competition with a great disadvantage. If you are a company in the developing world, a pharmaceutical innovator, and you want to compete in cancer or in diabetes, good luck to you. It's going to be very difficult because big Western companies have already spent billions of dollars on those diseases, and they have a huge head start over you. If you want to compete in malaria or schistosomiasis or tuberculosis, you have a much, much better chance to compete because the Western big pharma companies haven't done any work on these diseases. And you have another little advantage here, that is that you have the patient population right at your doorstep. You have people with malaria, tuberculosis, and so on nearby in your own country, whereas the big Western companies have to go abroad to other countries in order to find subjects for their clinical trials and so on. So I think on the whole, the Health Impact Fund, obviously it's not going to achieve global justice overnight, but the Health Impact Fund is going to right the balance in favor of pharmaceutical innovation in the developing world. It's going to help fledgling pharmaceutical innovators in poorer countries to thrive and to be competitive, especially in regard to the diseases of poverty.
Thank you, Doctor. And we have another question from Rena. Is the Health Impact Fund an operating project, or is it still a proposal?
It is still a proposal, so we are 2 steps away from its realization. The first step that we are now hopefully about to take is one where we will run a pilot. We've done a small pilot in southern India in a state called Kerala, and that was mainly just a measurement pilot where we showed that we can measure the impact of drugs that were coming to people anyway and sort of collect the data that we need to collect in order to get a sense of how much difference these drugs make in the lives of people. The pilot that we are now planning is a larger pilot. It would cost about $100 million, and it would be a pilot that would really pay incentive money to participating pharmaceutical innovators, would pay them for bringing a drug that they typically would not introduce into a poor country context, into such a poor country context, and deliver it there at a reasonable, affordable price. That is something that typically would not make them any money, but we would give them incentive payments for the health impact that they achieve. So this pilot would test not only our ability to measure health impact, but it would also test the ability to incentivize pharmaceutical innovators to produce real health gains among poor people. If that goes well, we have a congressional appropriation pending in the US Congress for that $100 million. So if that works well, and if the test is successful, then we hope that countries, or at least a group of countries, will be willing to put in enough money to start the Health Impact Fund in earnest.
Thank you, Doctor. Is there any more questions? Does anyone else have something to say?
Actually, no more. It seems no more questions, and I want to be respectful of your time, Thomas, as well.
Yeah.
So really appreciate it. Thanks a lot, and we will keep in touch.
Yes. All the best.
Okay. Have a good day. Bye.
Yeah,
Thank you
too.
all. Bye.
Thank you, Doctor.
Bye-bye.
Bye.